if I told you that the books, school notebooks, and even banknotes we are familiar with exist in their current form only because of a single catastrophe that occurred 12 centuries ago? There are moments in human history when the clang of swords drowns out the voice of reason, but the echo of that clang changes civilization more than hundreds of years of peaceful development. The two greatest empires of the time, the Tang dynasty of China and the Abbasid Caliphate, moved toward each other for decades, like tectonic plates, to converge on a single point in Central Asia. None of the commanders on that hot July day thought about cultural heritage or what it meant. Their minds were this battle became a point of no return, forever dividing the spheres of influence between East and West, and defining the borders that still exist on maps today. But the main trophy of the victors was not gold, horses, or land, but living people who held in their memories a secret capable of turning the world upside down. Watch the video to the end to find out how defeat on the battlefield gave humanity the most powerful tool for preserving knowledge. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the world map was actually redrawn in the 8th century? It is important to understand that by the middle of the 8th century, the world was divided between two superpowers that, until a certain point, did not even suspect each other's existence as a real threat. In the East, the Tang Empire flourished, reaching the peak of its power, controlling the Silk Road and extending its influence far beyond the Great Wall. In the West, the young and aggressive Abbasid Caliphate was gaining strength, its armies under black banners sweeping away old dynasties and carrying a new faith from the sands of Arabia to the borders of India. Between these two millstones lay Central Asia, a region of rich trading cities, oases, and warlike nomadic tribes. Chinese garrisons advanced further and further west, establishing protectorates over small principalities and demanding obedience from local rulers. General Gao Xianji, governor of the Western lands, was the embodiment of imperial ambition, a talented strategist who was undefeated in mountain campaigns. He led his legions across the impassable passes of the Pamirs, making crossings that seemed impossible for the large armies of the time. The Chinese infantry, clad in plate armor, and heavy cavalry inspired fear and respect in anyone who dared to stand in their way. On the other hand, from the west, a wave of Arab conquest was advancing inexorably. Led by the governor Ziyad ibn Saleh, an experienced commander hardened in battles to establish a new dynasty. The Caliphate saw these lands not just as territory, but as the key to complete control over the entire world trade in silk and spices. The local rulers of Sogdiana and Fergana, caught between a rock and a hard place, were forced to choose sides, constantly changing their patrons. Intrigue, bribery, and secret alliances became as commonplace here as trading in the bazaar. The conflict had been brewing for years, fueled by minor skirmishes, diplomatic insults, and mutual cultural misunderstandings. The spark was a request for help from the ruler of the city of Tashkent, who had been executed by a Chinese general on charges of treason. The son of the executed ruler fled to the Arabs, begging for protection and revenge, which gave the Caliphate the perfect excuse for open intervention. Two huge armies began to converge, drawing their forces to the Talas River Valley, a place that was destined to become a graveyard for thousands of soldiers. This was not just a war for territory, it was a clash between two different military schools, two worldviews, and two ways of waging war. The Chinese army relied on discipline, the complex tactics of crossbowmen, and the power of heavy infantry acting as a single mechanism. The Arab army relied on mobility, the fierce onslaught of light cavalry, and the fanatical devotion of its warriors. Neither side had an accurate idea of the enemy's strength, relying only on rumors and intelligence reports. Gao Xianji's campaign to Talas was a show of force designed to once and for all discourage the barbarians from challenging the emperor's authority. He gathered under his banners not only Chinese soldiers, but also mercenaries from among the Karluks, steppe nomads whose loyalty could always be bought with hard cash. The Caliphate's army was also heterogeneous, including troops from conquered peoples and allies ready to fight against Chinese expansion. The air in the Talas Valley was literally buzzing with tension when the advance guards of the two armies saw each other for the first time. Historians still argue about the exact number of troops, but it is clear that there were tens of thousands of people gathered in one place far from their capitals. Supplying such armies required enormous effort, with caravans of provisions stretching for many kilometers along dusty roads. Water and fodder became strategic resources for which a separate, silent war was waged. Every day of delay depleted forces and resources, pushing the commanders to take decisive action. No one wanted to give in because retreat would mean losing face and influence throughout the region. The stakes were too high: control over the heart of Asia and the flow of wealth along the Silk Road. The meeting of two civilizations had to be resolved with iron and blood, leaving no room for compromise. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the inevitability of conflicts between great empires? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of the story. Guess what happened next when the decision to march was made? Gao Xianji's army began one of the most difficult journeys in military history, moving through the Tian Shan and Pamir mountain ranges. These places, called the roof of the world, were a deadly trap for anyone who was not prepared for the harsh conditions of the high mountains. Icy winds, thin air, and narrow trails where two horsemen could barely pass each other became the first test for the Chinese legions. The soldiers of the Tang Empire were well equipped, but even their sturdy armor and warm clothing did not save them from the piercing cold of the nights. The supply and weapon convoys moved slowly, the wheels of the carts broke on the rocky slopes, and the pack animals fell into the abyss. Every step was difficult, breathing was labored, and strength was depleted faster than on the plains. Nevertheless, the iron discipline imposed by the general forced the columns to move forward. Gao Xianji, nicknamed Master of the Mountains, personally supervised the advance, demanding maximum effort from his officers. He understood that the success of the campaign depended on how quickly and unexpectedly his army could descend into the valley. Surprise was his main trump card, a way to stun the enemy, who did not expect an attack from this side. Engineering units marched at the forefront, building bridges across turbulent mountain rivers and clearing debris. The Chinese army included specialized infantry units armed with long-range crossbows and long spears. The cavalry, the pride of the empire, led their horses by the reins, conserving the animal's strength for the upcoming battle. The Karluks, mercenaries accustomed to life in the saddle, and knowing the local trails better than any map, occupied a special place. Their light cavalry provided reconnaissance and cover for the main forces. The descent from the mountains into the Fergana Valley was a relief for the soldiers, exhausted by weeks of travel over the rocks. The warm air, the availability of water and fresh grass for the horses raised the morale of the troops. Here on the plain, the Chinese military machine could deploy its full power, using its usual tactical formations. However, the Talas River Valley, where the enemy was already waiting for them, was still ahead. Local residents watched in horror as the huge army passed through, hiding their food supplies and driving their livestock into the mountains. Rumors of the approach of the dragons from the east spread faster than the wind, reaching the Arab camp. Ziyad ibn Salih, aware of the Chinese movement, did not sit back in defense, but advanced his forces to meet them. He chose a position near the city of Atla, not far from the river, where the terrain allowed him to take advantage of his cavalry. For the Chinese soldiers, this campaign was not just a military operation, but a journey to the edge of the known world. They walked through lands that were the stuff of legends, seeing unfamiliar customs and hearing incomprehensible speech. Many of them understood that they might never return home to their native villages among the rice fields. But the emperor's order was law, and loyalty to the dynasty was their reason for living. As they approached the Talas River, the tension grew, and scouts increasingly clashed with Arab advance units. It became clear that the enemy had no intention of fleeing at the sight of the Tang banners, and was ready to fight. General Gao Xianji, confident in the superiority of his tactics and weaponry, was preparing to teach these upstarts from the West a lesson. He did not know that an enemy equal in strength and superior in cunning awaited him. The landscape around me was changing, the mountains receding, giving way to sun-scorched steppes. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves hung thick in the air, obscuring the horizon. Soldiers checked their weapons, sharpened their swords, and adjusted their armor, preparing for the most important battle of their lives. They had gone through the hell of the mountains to face another hell on earth. How much do you think the terrain affects the outcome of a battle, even with numerical superiority? Want to know a secret that will change your view of the Arab conquests? The Caliphate army standing on the banks of the Talas was not a disorderly horde of nomads, as the Chinese imagination often portrayed them. It was a highly organized, ideologically motivated, and professional military force that had been tempered by civil wars. The Abbasids, who had recently come to power, brought with them black banners and a new philosophy of warfare, where religion and state were one and the same. The core of Ziyad ibn Salih's army was heavy Khorasan cavalry, warriors who had been trained in the art of horse riding and sword fighting since childhood. They were protected by chainmail and helmets, and their horses were enduring and fast. Unlike European knights, they relied not on battering rams, but on maneuverable combat and masterful fencing. Alongside them stood infantry armed with long spears and shields, capable of holding their ground against enemy attacks. Archers played a special role, their shooting skills renowned throughout the East. They used powerful composite bows capable of piercing light armor at a considerable distance. Arab tactics were often based on wearing down the enemy with constant fire, followed by a swift cavalry attack. They knew how to quickly regroup, retreat, and attack again, giving the enemy no respite. But the main weapon of the Caliphate was faith, which united people of different tribes and languages under one banner. The warriors believed that death in battle with infidels opened a direct path to paradise, which made them fearless and ready for self-sacrifice. Before the battle, mullahs read sermons, raising morale and reminding them of the great victories of the past. This created a special psychological state that was difficult to break even with superior force. Ziyad ibn Salih also attracted many allies from local Turkic-speaking tribes to his side. He skillfully exploited the local population's dissatisfaction with the harsh policies of the Chinese, promising them autonomy and protection. The Tibetan Empire, a longtime rival of China, also sent its troops to support the Caliphate, seeing a chance to weaken its neighbor. This made the Arab army multinational and diverse, but united in its goal. The Arab camp was a city of tents, where strict order and discipline reigned. Commanders checked posts, monitored the condition of weapons and horses, and did not allow any slackness. Intelligence worked continuously, delivering information about every movement of the Chinese army. Ziyad knew that he was facing an experienced general and was not going to give him a single chance. The soldiers of the Caliphate were masters of ambushes and surprise attacks, using their knowledge of the terrain against the invading Chinese. They poisoned wells along the enemy's route, destroyed fodder, and launched night attacks. It was a war of attrition, designed to wear down the enemy before the final battle. The Arabs understood that time was on their side, as they were closer to their supply bases. Unlike the Chinese, who relied on complex formations and drum signals, the Arabs gave more initiative to mid-level commanders. This allowed them to respond flexibly to changes in the situation during battle. They knew how to improvise, find weak spots in the enemy's defenses, and deliver pinpoint strikes. For them, the battle at Talas was not just about defending their borders, but a jihad, a holy war to establish the true faith. Each warrior felt like part of a grand plan, an instrument in the hands of higher powers. This confidence in their righteousness gave them the strength to stand to the death under a hail of Chinese arrows. Like this, if you are interested in learning how these two indomitable forces clashed. What if I showed you a time machine that could transport us straight to July 751? Imagine the wide valley of the Talas River, surrounded by sun-scorched hills, where the air shimmers with the summer heat. Two huge armies stand facing each other, creating a wall of shields, spears, and banners stretching for several kilometers. The river, flowing peacefully between them, has become the only dividing line between life and death for tens of thousands of people. The Chinese army took up positions based on the classic tactics of the Tang dynasty. In the center were dense rows of infantry with long spears and large shields. Heavy cavalry was positioned on the flanks, ready for a crushing blow, and behind them stood rows of crossbowmen. The Karluks, those unreliable allies, were placed on the flanks or in reserve, their roles still unclear. Gao Xianji, in his shining armor, rode around the formation, inspiring confidence in his soldiers with his mere presence. Opposite them, like a dark cloud, stood the army of the Caliphate, their black banners swaying lazily in the hot wind. The Arabs had built deep defensive echelons, knowing that the Chinese's first strike would be devastating. Their light cavalry pranced in front of the formation, shouting insults and challenging their enemies to duels, trying to provoke an attack. Ziad ibn Salih watched the battlefield from a hill, surrounded by his best commanders. The first days of the confrontation were spent in minor skirmishes and exchanges of fire as the sides tested each other's defenses. Archers on both sides exchanged volleys, and the sky darkened with clouds of arrows flying with a terrifying whistle. The Chinese crossbows had greater range and penetrating power, inflicting significant damage on the Arab ranks. But the Arabs responded with the rapid fire of their archers, creating a continuous hail of death. The ground between the armies was covered with the bodies of fallen horses and men, but neither side dared to launch a full-scale attack. The heat became unbearable, the sun at its zenith heating the armor so that it was impossible to touch. Water became more precious than gold, and fierce battles were fought for access to the river. Soldiers slept fitfully, without removing their armor, waiting for the alarm to sound at any moment. Gao Xianji understood that a long stand was disadvantageous to his army, which was far from home and experiencing supply problems. He was looking for an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow that would knock the Arabs back and force them to flee. Chinese engineers tried to build bridges, but each time they came under heavy fire. The situation was like a taut string that was about to snap. The Arabs, for their part, were in no hurry, relying on Allah's help and waiting for their enemy to make mistakes. They strengthened their positions, dug trenches, and set up barriers against cavalry. Their tactics were passive-aggressive. They wore down the Chinese, forcing them to remain constantly on edge. Ziad knew that all was not well in the Chinese rear and counted on it. The landscape of the valley gave no clear advantage to either side. It was an open field, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. Dust whipped up by the wind stung the eyes, creaked between the teeth, and covered everything in a gray film. The sounds of trumpets and drums carried across the plain, giving commands and keeping the rhythm of the great confrontation. Nature stood still in anticipation of the storm created by human hands. The officers of the Tang army looked anxiously at the Karluk troops, who kept themselves apart and were suspiciously quiet. Whispers of possible treachery circulated among the soldiers, but discipline forbade them from discussing orders. Everyone understood that battle was inevitable, and each prayed to their gods for protection. On the fifth day, the commander's patience ran out, and the drums sounded the signal for a general attack. The earth shook under the hooves of thousands of horses, and two living waves rushed towards each other. The battle that would decide the fate of Asia had begun. How do you think a soldier feels moments before clashing with the enemy? The battle began with a deafening roar as two walls of shields collided with the force of an earthquake. The cries of men, the neighing of horses, and the clang of metal merged into a single terrifying din that drowned out all other sounds. The Chinese infantry, acting as a single organism, pressed the Arab ranks with their long spears, trying to break through the center. The Arabs responded with fierce counterattacks, their swordsmen cutting into the enemy's ranks, trying to find gaps in the wall of shields. The heavy cavalry of the Tang, clad in lamellar armor, descended on the flanks of the Arab army. It was a terrible blow. The horsemen and their horses were so well protected that arrows bounced off them without causing any harm. They trampled the light Arab cavalry, knocking riders off their horses and crushing them under their hooves. It seemed that the Chinese war machine was grinding everything in its path, slowly but surely advancing forward. However, the Arabs showed remarkable resilience, retreating but not breaking formation. Their archers, pulling back, continued to shower the Chinese with arrows. aiming at unprotected areas. The Arabs' light cavalry used hit-and-run tactics, attacking the Chinese flanks and immediately retreating, not allowing themselves to be drawn into a protracted battle. This allowed them to wear down the enemy's heavy horsemen, forcing them to chase shadows. In the center, a fierce hand-to-hand battle raged, where fencing skills meant less than strength and endurance. People were crushing each other, the rear ranks pushing on the front ones, not even allowing the dead to fall. Dust and heat turned the battlefield into a stifling oven, where the air was saturated with the smell of sweat and iron. Soldiers were suffocating, losing consciousness from dehydration, but continued to strike mechanically. General Gao Xianji personally commanded the battle, throwing reserves into the breach and trying to build on the success on the right flank. He saw that the Arab formation was buckling and felt victory was near. His crossbowmen fired accurately at enemy commanders, trying to decapitate the Arab army. Chinese discipline was still prevailing over Arab pressure, but Ziyad ibn Salih did not sit idly by either. He skillfully maneuvered his forces, closing the gaps with fresh troops. He used Tibetan reserves to hold back the Chinese cavalry. Arab commanders inspired their soldiers by personal example, throwing themselves into the most dangerous parts of the battle. The scales were tipping, but not leaning to either side. The battle broke up into many separate pockets, where troops fought surrounded by enemies, having lost contact with their command. Banners fell and rose again, marking the sites of the fiercest fighting. The ground became slippery, and the soldiers had to keep their balance amid the chaos of bodies and broken weapons. By midday, fatigue began to take its toll on both sides. The pace of the battle slowed, and the blows became heavier and slower. People were acting at the limits of human capabilities, driven only by the instinct for survival. The water in their flasks had long since run out, and thirst tormented the soldiers more than their wounds. Despite fierce resistance, the Chinese continued to press forward, slowly pushing the Arabs back toward the river. It seemed that one more effort would cause the enemy to falter and flee, and victory would be theirs. But war is the art of deception, and what seemed like victory was only a prelude to disaster. None of the fighting Chinese noticed what was happening behind them, preoccupied as they were with the battle against the enemy in front of them. But there in the rear, a movement was beginning that would change everything. What if I told you that the battle lasted not 1 hour, but 5 whole days of bloody confrontation? Imagine the exhausting tension when each dawn brings only new attacks and new losses. From morning to night, the valley was filled with the clang of metal, and at night with the moans of the wounded and the anxious cries of the sentries. Both armies were exhausted, resources were running out, and a decisive breakthrough was still not forthcoming. The Chinese infantry, despite their training, were beginning to tire of the endless attacks on the Arabs' flexible defenses. The heavy armor that had provided protection was now a burden under the scorching sun. The cavalry horses were exhausted, many having fallen from arrows or exhaustion. Gao Xianji looked anxiously at his thinning ranks, realizing that his initial plan for a quick victory had failed. The Arabs also suffered heavy losses, their ranks were thinning, and every meter of ground was hard won. But they were on their own territory, and the support of the local population gave them a slight advantage in supplies. Small reinforcements from neighboring cities were approaching them, replenishing their losses. The morale of the Muslims remained high, sustained by faith and preaching. During those days, the true nature of warfare at that time became apparent. It was a battle of endurance of will and body. Commanders on both sides tried to outwit each other with feigned retreats and ambushes. But experienced armies did not fall for simple tricks. And it all came down to brute force. The stalemate on the chessboard of war was becoming increasingly apparent. The Karluk, who made up a significant part of the Chinese army, had been passive all these days, trying not to get involved in the fiercest battles. Their commanders were discussing something, sending messengers in different directions. Gao Xianji, busy directing the battle, did not attach any importance to this, considering it to be the usual cowardice of mercenaries. This was his fatal mistake. At night, the fires of the two camps burned opposite each other, like a reflection of the starry sky on the ground. Soldiers repaired their armor, bandaged their wounds, and shared the remains of their meager food. In these moments, the enemies were similar in their fatigue and fear of tomorrow. War made everyone equal, erasing the differences between Chinese and Arabs. By the fifth day, it became clear that the situation needed to be resolved. Otherwise, both armies would simply die of exhaustion. Ziyad ibn Salih decided to play his trump card, which he had been saving all this time. Secret negotiations with the leaders of the Karluks, which had been going on even before the battle, finally bore fruit. Gold and promises of power did their job. A heavy sense of foreboding hung in the air, which even the animals could sense, shifting restlessly from foot to foot. The wind changed, now blowing in the faces of the Chinese soldiers, carrying with it dust and the smell of the enemy camp. It was a sign that many interpreted as a bad omen. Gao Xianji prepared his troops for a decisive attack, gathering his last reserves into a fist. He hoped to break through the center of the Arabs and end the battle with one powerful blow. He did not look back, where the Karluks' cavalry units were lined up, supposedly to support the attack. In history, it often happens that the fate of empires is decided not by ingenious plans, but by simple betrayal. And at that moment, the mechanism of disaster had already been set in motion. Do you think betrayal can be justified if it saves your people from destruction? The Karluks, a nomadic people of Turkic origin, were the very variable that Chinese strategists had not taken into account. They were mercenaries for whom war was a craft and loyalty was a commodity. For many years, they had served the Tang dynasty, guarding the borders and participating in campaigns, but they always felt like outsiders in the imperial system. Chinese officials treated them with arrogance, considering them barbarians fit only for the dirty work of war. Tension between the Karluk and the Chinese command had been building for years. Unpaid wages, unfair distribution of spoils, and constant humiliation undermined the mercenaries' loyalty. The Arabs, on the other hand, offered them equal partnership and respect, as well as a generous share of the spoils. The choice for the Karluks' leaders became increasingly obvious as the battle dragged on. In secret from Gao Xianji, the Karluks' leaders met with Ziyad's envoys. The agreement was simple: strike the rear of the Chinese army in exchange for independence and wealth. It was a cynical but pragmatic calculation, typical of steppe diplomacy. They waited for the moment when the Chinese would be most exhausted and engrossed in battle. On the battlefield, the Karluks took up positions on the flanks and rear of the Chinese formation. This allowed them to control the retreat routes and supply trains. The Chinese, confident in their strength, entrusted them with guarding their rear, which ultimately led to their downfall. The Karluks, watching the course of the battle, saw that the dragon was tired and vulnerable. There was unusual excitement in their camp, with warriors saddling fresh horses and checking their bows. They knew that soon they would play the leading role in this drama. Their eyes were not on the Arabs, but on the backs of the Chinese infantrymen standing in front of them. The political situation in the steppe also dictated its own terms. The strengthening of the Tang Empire threatened the independence of all nomadic tribes. The Karluks understood that a Chinese victory at Talas would lead to the complete subjugation of the steppe to the emperor. A Chinese defeat, on the other hand, would open up new opportunities for them to create their own state. This was not just a mercenary revolt, but a geopolitical maneuver. The Karluks had to choose between their old master, who despised them, and their new ally, who needed them, and they chose in favor of their own interests. When the signal was given, 20,000 Karluk horsemen set off, but instead of attacking the Arabs, they turned their horses around. It was the moment of truth when an ally turned into an executioner. For the ordinary Chinese soldiers, exhausted by days of fighting, it came as a complete shock. They could not believe their eyes when they saw their rear being attacked by those who were supposed to defend it. Panic, the worst enemy of any army, began to spread through the ranks faster than wildfire. A third force entered the game, and the rules of battle changed instantly. Now it was no longer a battle between two armies, but a beating of one of them, caught in a pincer movement. The climax came suddenly, like a thunderclap in a clear sky. In the midst of another Chinese attack, when all attention was focused on the Arab positions, the Karluks struck. 20,000 horsemen with a wild cry descended on the unprotected rear of the Chinese army, sweeping away the supply trains and reserve units. It was not just betrayal, it was annihilation. The Chinese soldiers, caught between the hammer of the Arab infantry and the anvil of the Karluk cavalry, were thrown into confusion. The formation, which had held for 5 days, fell apart in a matter of minutes. The commander's orders were lost in the general chaos, and no one understood who was friend and who was foe. The Karluks, who knew the Chinese identification marks well, struck without fail. The Arabs, seeing the signal, launched a general offensive across the entire front. Encouraged by the support, they threw themselves with redoubled energy at the disorganized enemy. The Chinese found themselves in a tight circle that was closing in with every passing minute. The disciplined army turned into a crowd trying to save itself. The heavy cavalry of the Tang, the pride of the empire, proved useless in such a melee. The horses could not gain speed. The riders were pulled from their saddles with hooks and finished off on the ground. The crossbowmen, left without cover, were cut down by the Karluk sabers. Banners fell into the dust, trampled underfoot by those running. Gao Xianzhi tried to organize a defense, gather loyal troops around him, and break through the ring. But his efforts were in vain. Panic was widespread. Soldiers threw down their heavy shields and spears to run faster, but there was nowhere to run. The Talas River, which had witnessed their ambitions, now became a barrier to salvation. The massacre was horrific. The victors showed no mercy, taking revenge for years of Chinese domination. The Karluks, eager to curry favor with their new allies, were particularly cruel. The valley was filled with bodies, and the water in the river turned brown. Only a small detachment of the general's personal guard managed to break through the encirclement. They fought their way through the ranks of their former allies, losing men at every step. Gao Xianzhi left the battlefield, humiliated and crushed, witnessing the destruction of his army. His career and dreams of glory remained lying in the dust of the Talas Valley. The surrounded Chinese troops continued to resist to the last, knowing that there would be no mercy. They stood in a circle, back to back, fighting off the advancing enemies until they fell from their wounds. These were the last flashes of heroism from a doomed army. By evening, it was all over. The huge imperial army had ceased to exist. Tens of thousands were killed, and even more were taken prisoner. The Caliphate's victory was complete and unconditional. This event came as a shock to the entire Eastern world. The invincible Tang Empire had suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of barbarians. The myth of Chinese power was swept away by the winds of the steppe. The remnants of the Chinese army, having broken out of the encirclement, fled eastward, pursued by Arab cavalry. It was a pitiful sight. Wounded, ragged, without weapons or supplies, they trudged through the passes they had recently crossed, with their banners flying proudly. The road back was littered with the corpses of those who had not survived the crossing or had been overtaken by the enemy. Gao Xianzhi returned to China with a handful of survivors. The emperor did not execute him, considering his past merits, but removed him from command. The defeat at Talas was the beginning of the end for the Tang's western expansion. Soon, the An Lushan rebellion broke out in the empire itself, which finally undermined the dynasty's power and forced China to forget about Central Asia for 1,000 years. For the Caliphate, this victory meant the consolidation of Islam in the region. Central Asia entered the orbit of Muslim civilization forever. The Arabs did not advance further east into China, realizing that their resources were not unlimited. The border between the two worlds stabilized. Local rulers, seeing the power of the Arabs, converted to Islam en masse and swore allegiance to the Caliph. Chinese cultural influence began to rapidly fade, giving way to Arab science, language, and religion. Buddhist monasteries were abandoned or converted into mosques. The defeat at Talas had enormous geopolitical consequences. The Silk Road came under the complete control of Muslim merchants. This enriched the Caliphate and contributed to the flourishing of Baghdad and Samarkand as centers of world trade and science. China closed itself off, focusing on internal problems. The Great Wall became not only a physical, but also a mental border separating the celestial empire from the West. Contacts with the outside world were reduced to a minimum. For the peoples of Central Asia, this was a turning point. The Turkic tribes, having accepted Islam, became part of the vast Islamic world, which determined their fate and culture for centuries to come. Writing, architecture, laws, everything changed under the influence of the new religion. Historians call the Battle of Talas one of the most important battles in history, although few people know about it. It stopped Chinese expansion and determined the religious map of Eurasia. If the Chinese had won, perhaps Europe would know Buddhist Central Asia today. But the most important and unexpected result of the battle was not the redrawing of borders, but what happened to the prisoners. It was in their bags and heads that something was hidden that would change the world more than any weapon. Thousands of Chinese craftsmen, engineers, and artists found themselves in the hands of the Arabs. They were taken to Samarkand, where they were to serve their new masters. Among them were masters who possessed a secret that China had kept for centuries. Among the many prisoners brought to Samarkand after the battle were Chinese craftsmen who knew the secret of making paper. Until then, both the Islamic world and European lands had continued to use expensive parchment or inconvenient papyrus, which tore easily and was unsuitable for mass writing. Paper was known only in China and remained an important state secret, guarded so strictly that its disclosure was punishable by death. But in captivity, life in relatively mild conditions became too strong an argument for the craftsmen, and they decided to reveal their knowledge. Soon, the first paper mill outside China was built in Samarkand. This was a huge deal because, before that, no one in the world knew how to make such a light and handy material in large quantities. It took local craftsmen very little time to understand the intricacies of the process. They learned to carefully grind old rags, mulberry bark, and other plant fibers, turning them into a soft mass that could be poured into molds. Gradually, the people of Samarkand mastered all the stages: long soaking in water, careful pressing, and drying the sheets in the sun. The city had enough clean water and suitable raw materials, so production became fast and cheap. Over time, local craftsmen even managed to improve some details of the process, achieving an even smoother surface. Samarkand paper earned a reputation as one of the highest quality in the world at that time. The advent of this paper sparked a veritable information revolution that changed the life of a vast region. Books became much more accessible, and the speed of knowledge dissemination increased almost beyond belief. Whereas previously it would have cost a fortune and taken months to copy the Quran or a major scientific work, such work now became more realistic and cheaper. Scribes were able to work faster, and scholars were able to record their thoughts more freely. Libraries in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba began to grow rapidly. Their collections were replenished with new treatises on medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and geography. During this period, people began to exchange manuscripts more actively, and travelers took books with them to bring knowledge back to their native lands. Paper became the engine of a huge cultural boom. Thanks to cheap paper, science in the Caliphate gained new support. Scientists could write and draw without restriction, astronomers mapped the sky, and poets created works that were later read throughout the East. It was a period when creative energy seemed to burst forth and find its ideal means of expression. The golden age of Islamic culture owes much to this unexpected result of a distant battle. It was from the Caliphate that the technology of paper production gradually spread to Europe, first through Spain, where Muslim and Christian cultures coexisted quite closely, then through Sicily, which was an important trading hub. This journey took many centuries, but the effect was as strong as it was in the East. European craftsmen adopted the technique and began to create their own paper centers. When paper became a common material in Europe, it paved the way for Gutenberg's invention. His printing press was able to work precisely because there was an affordable material that could be produced in large quantities and relatively cheaply. This invention gave impetus to the spread of books, changes in religious views, and the rapid growth of scientific knowledge. The entire history of the Reformation and the subsequent scientific revolution is largely based on this simple object. Paradoxically, the Battle of Talas, which was brutal and claimed many lives, became a catalyst for enlightenment. The weapons raised for destruction inadvertently paved the way for parchment, ink, and ideas. China, having lost part of its army and influence in the region, gave the world one of its greatest inventions, although it did so not of its own volition. History sometimes moves forward in such unexpected ways. We rarely think about where the things we take for granted come from. The sheet of paper on which you write or print text is a direct descendant of the sheets made in Samarkand more than 12 centuries ago. Every book, every school notebook, bears the echo of that ancient battle. It is a remarkable reminder of how war and progress can intertwine in the strangest ways. If you imagine a world without paper, it becomes clear how important these events were. Perhaps we would still be writing on calfskin, and books would remain so expensive that only a few could afford to read them. History could have taken a different path, and the development of human thought would have slowed down for centuries. This makes us appreciate even those changes that emerged from the shadows of violent conflicts. The history of the Battle of Talas teaches us that the world is smaller than it seems, and the consequences of our actions can echo through the centuries. The clash of ambitions between two empires led to the deaths of thousands of people, but it also set off a chain reaction that changed the face of civilization. We saw how betrayal, tactics, and chance became entangled in a knot that only time could untie. A piece of paper which became an accidental trophy turned out to be more important than all the conquered lands. This story reminds us that the true value of civilization is measured not by the size of its territory, but by the knowledge it is able to preserve and pass on. What surprised you most about this story? The role of the traitorous Karluks or the unexpected paper ending of the battle? Suggest in the comments what other little-known but fateful battles you would like to learn about. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover the secrets of history with us.